So, welcome. I'm Mike Leeds. I'm a professor in the economics department, and I'll be moderating this session on global effects of the coronavirus pandemic. You know, one of the many costs imposed by this pandemic is the isolation that it has brought to nations, communities, even individual households. So it's refreshing and important, really, to see Temple holding events like this International Education Week. This session and other sessions like it over the next several days will illustrate the global reach of Temple and the opportunities that it provides to students through study abroad and to faculty through innovations like the International Collaboration Connection Program, in which instructors can call upon scholars from Temple's global campuses to provide an international perspective in their classes. For more on this program, I believe, yes, we've provided a URL that has just been sent out through chat, so please do take advantage of it. I'm personally delighted to be in the presence of a really special panel of speakers today. They represent an array of a variety of fields of expertise and come to us from Asia, Europe, and even Philadelphia. The members of this panel are Dr. Fabienne Darling-Wolf, who is a professor in the journalism department and director of the Media and Communications doctoral program in Temple University's Lou Klein College of Media and Communication. Dr. Darling-Wolf holds a PhD in mass communications from the University of Iowa, and her research deals with global media flows and processes of transnational cultural influence and their intersection with dynamics of gender, class, race, and ethnicity. Dr. Jeffrey Kingston, who will be joining us virtually, is a professor of history and Asian studies at Temple University, Japan, where he also serves as director of the Asian studies major. Dr. Kingston holds a PhD in history from Columbia University, and his research focuses on Asian nationalisms, contemporary Japan, contested history, and transitional justice in Asia. Dr. Francesca Romana Lenzi is Associate Professor of General Sociology at Università degli Studi di Roma Foro Italico, as well as at Temple University, Rome. She holds an MA in International Relations and a PhD in European History. Her main areas of research deal with sociological theory, deviance, the sociology of the city, health, and lifestyles. Dr. Karen Lin occupies the Abraham Roth Chair in Preventive Medicine at Temple University's Lewis Katz School of Medicine, where she is a professor of clinical medicine and director of the acupuncture program. She holds a Master of Public Health and a Doctor of Medicine degree from the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. Her clinical interests include medical acupuncture and primary care and preventative medicine, while her research interest is in medical education. Dr. Aimee J. Palumbo is Assistant Professor of Instruction in Epidemiology and Biostatistics in Temple University's College of Public Health. She holds a PhD from Drexel University's Dornsife School of Public Health with a focus on life course social exposures. Prior to moving to Philadelphia, she spent 3 years at the Pennsylvania Department of Health, working on infectious disease surveillance and outbreak investigations. Her current research explores how social exposures, including where we live and work, influence health. Our panel is going to discuss several different aspects of the coronavirus pandemic. The first theme will be perspectives on government responses and the initially botched reaction by world governments. We'll begin with recordings from Jeffrey Kingston.
Suzanne, I don't believe the sound is coming out.
Sorry about that. Trying again.
Yeah, I think it's generally agreed the Diamond Princess was a wake-up call for Japan, and the Japanese government didn't respond very effectively to that. And then following that, basically Abe was missing in action. And so on Japanese social media and the Japanese media, people are going, where's Abe? I mean, he was just sort of, not rising to the occasion. And clearly the pandemic has been a stress test for leaders all over the world, and not many have covered themselves in glory. And certainly Abe is one of those. So to show that he was really on top of things and to sort of counter the criticism, he holds a news conference on a Friday, announces that Monday schools will be closed. And he didn't consult anybody, not his Minister of Education, not public health specialists. Essentially, it was a PR gesture to send a message, I'm on top of this. But what it did is suddenly all these parents are going, oh my God, what am I gonna do about my kid come Monday? So he was trying to show leadership, but all he did was make the situation much worse for everybody with kids. And so the upshot was that a lot of women had to take leave. A lot of them left their jobs. And so this was very disruptive. He followed this with, showing on his Twitter account, a video of him sipping tea, patting his dog, and, channel surfing. And the reaction to this was, oh my God, you're so clueless about what's going on for normal people, right? So it just sort of reinforced the image of Abe is clueless, out of touch, doesn't know what's going on. And then of course there was the fiasco of the Abe no mask, where he announces with great fanfare that he's going to distribute 2 masks to every household. And of course, there's lots of people being very sarcastic about that. What if you have more than 2 people in your household? End of the day, it took too long, cost too much, and the masks were too small. So all in all, in terms of PR, Abe did terribly. In terms of the public health response, it did seem Abe waited too long to declare a national emergency. It seemed that he was very much prioritizing the Olympics and his summit meeting with Xi Jinping.
And so Jeff Kingston
Yeah, I
is
think
here.
it's generally agreed the Diamond Princess.
Jeff Kingston here was talking, of course, about the failures of Prime Minister Abe initially, but clearly some things began to go right in Japan, and this is now Jeff Kingston telling us what went right. Before we begin, I was remiss to say, or not to say, that if you have any questions that you wish to ask of the panelists, please take advantage of the chat feature, and we will spend the last 15 minutes of our session devoted to question and answer. So please do feel free to submit questions via chat. We can now go on to what maybe the Japanese government did right.
So, what is it that Japan did to lower the mortality? I mean, hospitals at one point in April were, at the edge of the abyss in terms of, they were running on empty. They had, very little extra space. The per capita availability of intensive care units in Japan is really low compared to, say, the United States or Italy or Spain, Germany. And so they were really at the edge. At one point, the governor of Osaka was calling for donations of, personal protective equipment for frontline health workers because they'd run out. And so the Hanshin Tiger baseball team stepped up to the plate. They donated several thousand, Tigers ponchos. Maybe not the ideal PPE, but better than nothing. And then we had pictures at Narita Airport where incoming passengers are put into quarantine. So when you imagine Japan, very developed, wealthy country, you're not thinking cardboard boxes. But this is where the quarantine was set up in Narita. They were putting out cardboard boxes. So this is a real shock, I think, to a lot of Japanese to see how poorly prepared their government was for this pandemic. And I think the reason is that basically in previous avian flu, the SARS outbreak, Japan, did relatively well, had relatively few cases. So I think it got a bit too complacent. And Abe was way too complacent. And I think his complacency filtered down. There was no real control tower in the bureaucracy in charge of this. So because nobody knew who was in charge, nobody was in charge. And so I think that that's why it took them so long to get traction on dealing with the pandemic.
Okay, again, Jeff Kingston joining us virtually, recorded because, of course, it's 5:30 in the morning in Tokyo right now. So moving to our panel, let me first ask Francesca Lenzi if she has something to add regarding government response.
Yes, strictly about government response, I can tell you something about a socio-political perspective with a couple of points. The first is that in general, speaking about the whole government around the world, I think that there is an unpreparedness of the Western national health services for a pandemic. Let's think that the last pandemic was the Spanish one, which was after the First World War. It means in a total different scenario, even maybe with another concept of health, firstly. And partially, I can add that there is a lack of Western democratic systems to adopt a corrective attitude and strategies of containment of the pandemic. The governments have adopted, there is a different attitude, maybe thinking about Italy or United States, for example. The countries like Italy that adopted a more rigor response, as the Italian one, have done it under the crossfire of the criticism of the oppositions. Since the economic and social implications have been instrumentalized. However, a more accomplishing and negationism sometimes, less anti-popular, less restrictive attitude has paid maybe in terms of lives and then even in electoral terms, as you maybe know. So yes, this is my position in sociological terms.
Karen Lim, do you have any perspectives on government action or inaction
Sure.
regarding the pandemic?
Sure. Well, I think that one of the things that we failed to do was to be able to leverage experts. So, for example, the Office of Pandemics and Emerging Threats, was an office that had been thinking about this and planning for pandemics that was not funded, throughout our government. And so that then certainly led to kind of a lack of a strategy when we actually faced the pandemic. I think also it was very challenging because there's certainly other countries which did it very well. And they've done it well because they had learned from prior epidemics such as SARS. So, as my colleague in Tokyo had mentioned, maybe they didn't take the initial learnings, but picked up very quickly. I would say that there are definitely other countries in Asia which learned very well, for example, Taiwan. And they had an infrastructure in which they were able to lean on the prior experiences, build the infrastructure both within the government and public health, and then have that clear communication with their citizens and their populace to be able to say, these are the things that need to occur. This is what's going on. A clear communication, one that's consistent amongst the various government agencies and consistent with science, and then a transparency. And so I think that was certainly a lot of the challenges that we had faced here in the United States, and the lack of a more national strategy where different states were competing with each other for PPE. Instead of being able to leverage that united force to be able to contract for better rates, to put our 50 states together against each other to try and get PPE for the healthcare workers was absolutely devastating. So I would say that those would be some of the failings that, while I'm coming from a medical standpoint and a public health and population standpoint, those things are absolutely embedded and intertwined with how our government communicates with the strategy and also, certainly with our society.
Thank you. Aimee, do you have anything you might add on as far as the government policy is concerned?
Yeah, I mean, I think I echo a lot of the sentiments by Dr. Lin, because I think, the lack of trust in, public health experts and, and in particular in the CDC kind of got put on a back burner, and, perhaps because of some initial missteps, but I think they then kind of fell out of, I'm talking about the US, of course, kind of fell out of a leadership role, at least from a communication standpoint. And I think that, that the public is sort of getting to the next question maybe, but, the public sentiment, I think, really influenced, the government's response and willingness to kind of make tough decisions as far as lockdowns and, restrictions. And then, of course, I think the other big misstep was kind of the initial poor messaging around mask wearing. I think at a really crucial time, globally, there was, kind of miscommunication and confusion about whether masks should be worn or not. And I think that was a critical time that happened and potentially had kind of consequences that we're still seeing.
Thank you. Fab, any perspectives?
Yeah, and so I do gender and race, and so I'm going to bring everything to that in every single one of our responses. But one of the things that I would point out, I mean, from a slightly different perspective, but it's only connected to all of the things that have been said, is that we have we've observed that the countries with female leaders have tended to do better than countries with male leaders. New Zealand, Finland, Taiwan, Germany, while certainly kind of recently had to go back into lockdown, that's still done. If you look at the curve of Germany versus other countries in Europe, you really see that difference. And that doesn't have, I mean, and there's been some research done on that, and that doesn't mean that women are intrinsically different kinds of leaders, but the research has demonstrated that, what happens is that having a female leader signals a more diverse government. So the governments that are led by women tend to have a more diversity in their ranks, and so a more multiplicity of perspectives included in the conversation. And also, as Karen was mentioning, the leveraging experts, and those leaders have had a tendency to be more open to listening to the advice of experts and to bringing them into the conversation, and managing to communicate that through those experts, and not contradict whatever the experts are saying, as our soon to not be president has been doing. And I do think, and again, moving into perhaps what the next questions is related to kind of the social responses. I mean, certainly in the US, we've also had a president, and that is the government response, right, who's basically turned mask wearing into a political issue, which I think has been particularly damaging, and which we're starting to have a discussion actually about the kind of the twisted definitions of macho masculinity, where wearing a mask is seen as not a manly thing to do, and President Trump has come out and made fun of Biden for wearing the biggest mask ever, right? And I think that also is part of the government response in the US, just the kind of messages that our leader has been sending. And I think that, while there's certainly other places where things have not gone well, those leaders, the kind of more populist leaders, Boris Johnson in the UK, he's another example, who kind of have that adhere to that kind of identity or toxic masculinity, have struggled with the pandemic a lot more, or have that attitude certainly hasn't helped in terms of the population's response.
I would just like to follow up on something that Fab actually brought up and maybe throw it out to our panel for some discussion, which is that many of the countries which seemed initially to succeed in suppressing the virus now seem to be facing a resurgence. Is this just a question of the government taking its eye off the ball? Is it just something that would have happened no matter how vigilant they were? What is there something about government policy that led to these apparent second waves? I'll throw it open to the panel. Any thoughts?
I'll take it. I mean, I think in some ways the second waves were inevitable. The extent of the mitigation efforts, I mean, any response by any country is going to, the effectiveness is going to depend on, the context, the local context, the financial, cultural, physical, environmental context. So there's not going to be, one strategy that works for everybody. And in places where, there might, inherently be closer people, you need a more stringent strategy during really intense outbreaks, but that's not sustainable. That's not sustainable long-term. And so I a little bit think that these second waves were somewhat inevitable, but the idea is, can we mitigate the risks as much as possible?
Sociologically speaking, people are living very differently the second wave. There is no more it's very difficult, as she was saying before, that it's very right that people are not so impressed by the new wave, because it's something we are living in since a long time, because it's almost a year, and even if the countries have had the different path through this pandemic, through this virus, this virus, it's true that now people are less available in doing efforts to face it. This is the very big problem of the second wave, I think, sociological speaking. So looking at actually the society in a very large sense, it means everyday life behavior and the respect of the rules and blah, blah, blah. Okay, there is a very big difference between the beginning of the virus and this second wave, in terms of behavior of people.
Okay.
And I should just say, even if I said a second wave is inevitable, the size of the second wave is not inevitable. That depends on our response. I'll just say that.
And I would agree with you. I think that when we look at the pandemic, right, the only strategies we had up until this point really was about behavior and human behavior. And that is extremely challenging. We all understand cognitively what needs to be done. And maybe that is also, we have been challenged in that as well. I'm not going to deny that. But the reality is, until there is something that is a little bit more reliable and not reliant on human behavior, like a vaccine, we will continue to see these oscillations of the ebb and flow of the pandemic and the number of infections. And this is not to say because people are terrible and people are selfish. I mean, there are various different arguments, but people are human social beings. in order to mitigate this virus and control it, we have to go against our own nature. And that is not sustainable in the long term. There are such devastating consequences psychologically, which then turns, into medical conditions and illnesses, on top of the social and political and the economic consequences. I mean, it's absolutely devastating on all fronts. And so people want to point a finger, and yes, I mean, I'm on the front lines. Yes, I understand the importance that people need to do the masks and the PPE and the social distancing, but this is not normal. I don't know how else to say it. Yeah.
I think that leads us very naturally, actually, to our next topic, which is the social response, not just governmental official policy response, but the way in which individuals, people, households, we've seen an array of different responses, some of them borderline on violence to this situation. And so we'd like to talk about how society responds and how health systems have responded to the pandemic. And we'll start again with the response from Jeff Kingston from Temple University, Japan.
Testing wasn't really working so well for them. Tracking and tracing, all that wasn't working so well. Cluster-based approach was overwhelmed. So how did Japan dodge the bullet? And it seems mostly this was common sense response by the Japanese public, not waiting for the government to tell them what to do. So essentially, in Japan, wearing masks is not a political statement. There's no fussing about wearing masks. People are used to wearing masks. A lot of people wear them all the time because of kafunsho, cedar pollen, allergies, due to pollution, whatever. But mask wearing here, is quite common. So people, just did it more often. They were very careful about social distancing, staying at home. It's the common sense response of the Japanese public made a big difference. And, they don't have the habit of shaking hands, of hugging, bussing on the cheeks, things like that. So, and they don't speak usually very loudly, right? So that's another, risk factor that they don't have.
Okay, so let's maybe shake things up a bit and start with Fabian Darling-Wolf. Fab, what perspectives do you have on social or health systems responses?
Yeah, sure. I mean, certainly the social and cultural implications have been really, there's obvious differences in the way that people are responding. I mean, as Jeff mentions, in Japan or in a lot of countries in Asia, I mean, my oldest daughter spent the whole first wave of the pandemic in South Korea and was still able to do a lot of things that we couldn't do here, right? Because in those cultures where mask wearing was already part of the culture, and where, because of in part the density of population and because of the way that things kind of normally work, people are a little bit more disciplined about social distancing and have to kind of deal with those issues kind of on a more regular basis. And I think more generally, I mean, I think one of the things in the US that has kind of hurt our ability to respond, or not only the fact that this mask wearing, again, as Jeff mentions, is here has turned into a political issue, but also the myth of the way that a society conceptualizes itself in the US, this idea of rugged individualism, that every person on their own, and ideas about freedom, even attitudes towards issues of privacy have been with contact tracing, for instance. I mean, I know that in South Korea, for instance, the way that one of the ways that they managed to contain the virus was through very effective contact tracing, which meant that you had to have an app on your phone, and everyone knew where you were going. And in European and in the US, European nations and in the US, that's something that perhaps that people are concerned about. We don't really want to give our government that much information about our whereabouts, right? And so I think all of those cultural factors have kind of come into the picture, with the US perhaps being on almost on one end of the spectrum in terms of individualism. Even countries like, so I'm originally from France, and I do research there, and I was in France this summer, and there is that concept of solidarité that we, even though that especially in southern French, people are not necessarily particularly disciplined, but there's still this idea that if we all this idea of the greater good, and that sometimes you have to sacrifice your own freedom for others, and so those cultural factors kind of do enter in that. And then in terms of the health systems, I think that and this is something that, I'll get to the other questions as well, we'll see probably continuing in the future, and this is also related to, I think, the economic dimensions in the countries that have had standardized healthcare and maybe a more centralized system of healthcare. It has been a little bit easier to access testing and masks and those kinds of things. And of course, it'll make potentially vaccine distribution a little bit easier than it is in a system like in the US that's very decentralized. And I think that's another thing that, and I wanted to point out in terms of the social reactions are also connected. Another challenge, I think, in the US is the fact that the health system is connected to people's employment. And so you have this double whammy of if you become unemployed because of the pandemic, you might also lose your health insurance. And so some of those behaviors are not just that we're seeing about, virus fatigue and those kinds of pandemic fatigue, and are not just social, they're also economic, because if you have your only choice is between going to work and feeding your family, or not being able to feed your family, then you're going to make choices that perhaps are not safe, but because you don't really have a choice, right? So it's not just an individual choice, it's also a social choice. Society as a group is deciding how we deal with with the people that are struggling, and I think those countries that have more of a culture where that is part of the culture, and the structures that can accommodate for that, may not avoid having a lot of cases, but it makes it a little bit easier to deal with.
Okay, thank you. Karen Lynn, do you have any perspectives on this?
Sure, and I echo a lot of what Fab has said. I think it really comes down to how strong is each country's society with regard to a societal compact for taking care of each other. And that is really demonstrated in a lot of different ways. That's embedded within cultural norms, societal norms. It's embedded in how healthcare is funded and structured. It is education. So all of those different things come into play for sure. I think, the one thing I find really interesting, so my parents actually having immigrated from Taiwan. I was born and raised here, and about 4 years ago, they sold everything, retired, and went back to Taiwan. So they've actually been there, and it's been fascinating to see the varied responses between Taiwan and the United States. And there is just such a strong sense of society and taking care of others, the elderly and the young, and that really, I think, comes down to play where, for example, when masks were a scarcity, and academic institutions and they came down and they developed apps to be able to track where there were available resources so that people, so that could be distributed equally with equal access to the populace. So those would be examples, I think, that were very much highlighted, in my experience and witnessing this past year.
Okay, Aimee, Palumbo, can you add something to this?
I mean, the only other thing I was thinking was kind of related to, I think, a comment Jeff gave in his recorded video about, their experience in some Asian countries with SARS and some other countries, and how that influenced the public response. And I think, we're a little bit victims of our own, kind of lack of having recently experienced any major outbreak. And I think we see that, kind of playing out, within the country as well. And with the responses, in places who didn't even see the first wave when we initially saw it in March. So I think, people are always going to, it's difficult, I think, to conceive sometimes of things that are happening, far away. And so people are, inevitably going to react with, what's happening around them and closest to them. And I think we have to, I don't know, just keep that in mind, when we think about how to better craft messaging and responses.
Okay, and Francesca, Lenzi.
Yes, thank you. Yes, I got more than one sociological issue to point out. Some consideration to introduce a sociological perspective is that, as we have said, this is for sure a new pandemic, even because this is a new era. We are in a technological, interconnected world, plus we are in the middle of an economical crisis that started years ago, but is still pending, and it interacts with the pandemic. So we live, the different countries in different situations live this situation of pandemic, which brings an economical crisis on an existing economical crisis. Speaking around the world. Plus, there is a time variable. This is a new event, so we were not supposed to have any structured plan, but this is just a partial justification, because if the world is moving faster and faster, we are supposed, or better, the government are supposed to have fast solutions and exit strategies to the event that happened. It means that the people let's say, ask the government to be as fast as the world they are governing, they're managing. So it means that the speed of the contagion impede the formulation of a common strategy. Even every country did by itself, even because no other solution were proposed. This creates a very big sense of uncertainty inside the soul of the people. It means that the reason why people are individually thinking, even in the common behavior, is because they don't have point of reference in this sense. This is the first consideration. The second consideration is that the development model of the Western countries have been put under a question point, let's say. It means that if we think to the impact of the crisis of the pandemic, we see that it is an urban pandemic. The zoonosis happened inside the urbanized areas of all over the world, and the countries that better faced this pandemic were countries not democratic, with non-democratic rules. It doesn't mean that the non-democratic way is the good way, but it means that democratic countries still don't have a strategy. Okay, so but the pandemic developed inside cities, inside areas with high contact between people. So it means that the socialization has been put under under judgment, and in some way this is shown of the vulnerabilities of the Western model. In all this situation of uncertainty, people started during the first wave of the pandemic discovering again the basic necessities like breathing, for example, or meeting the parents, or having contact with other people, or not being alone in a world that boosted the idea of an individual life. We can stay alone, live alone, being single. And now we find ourselves that the people that live alone, really, they can't have contact, because if you don't live in a house with another person, the contact with the other people are filtered by the mask, by the social distance, and blah, blah, blah. So take care, for example, of the fragile part of the population, the elderly ones, for example, or in addiction, the importance of the proximity, the socialization, the importance of a sense of community, for example, to work, to have all a common cause, let's say, not against someone, the stranger that still has the job, or the people of another race, blah, 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 but work all together because the problem is common. All these things are in some way showing a necessity of come back to priorities. For example, during the first wave of pandemic, people were not able to, in Italy, were not able to grab foods, because to go to the market and find food was a problem with the social distance and the lockdown, etc. So we started considering new priorities during this strange period. And let me finish with a consideration that it is taken by the social theory. There is Robert Michels, which is a sociologist, say that he speaks about the fragility of the social identity, and he say that for example, a group of people, a nation, if there is a public, if a social identity is a fragile identity, a public enemy normally helps that social identity to be stronger, because they find the common cause. In this case, in this situation, we don't have a public enemy. The virus is invisible. We can't be united against someone. We have to be united to save ourselves, the one by the other. So it means that we have to find a reason in favor of the humanity, not against a group or against someone else, because we have to be united to make it happen, let's say. Okay, so it is a very challenging situation for the humanity, individually speaking and socially speaking, to fight for a common cause.
Okay. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'm going to combine our last two topics, and I want to remind our audience, if you have questions, please do enter them in chat, and we'll be happy to raise them during the Q&A at 5:30. But it may sound odd to combine kind of long-term economic complications or long-term economic implications of the coronavirus with medical implications, and what might the medical world have in store in the near to medium term. But certainly as an economist, one of the things that economic studies have shown is that it's not been the supply side that has led to the sharp economic decline, the sharp rise of unemployment, but rather it's been on the demand side. People are afraid. People aren't going out. People aren't spending money. And until they are confident that they can do so safely, there will not be a complete economic recovery. So the two are certainly interrelated. In addition, there are a number of potentially long-term damaging aspects of the pandemic, one of which we are seeing in the relatively high unemployment rates among women. This has been called a she-cession in some cases, that women have been very disproportionately affected by this recession, partly because of where they are employed, what sectors of the economy, but also we're seeing a significant decline in women's labor force participation. Not only are women being displaced, but women have stopped looking for jobs, or not even looking for jobs. And this dissociation of women from the labor market can have significant long-term implications for the well-being of women in the economy. In addition, there are some sectors of the economy that may simply never come back. Are doing something like this, where we're all communicating via Zoom, my attending conferences via Zoom, suggests that the hospitality industry may never come back fully. The transportation, airline industries may never come back fully. So I'd like to get your perspectives on both the kind of medical, what the medical outlook is in the kind of short to medium term, and then maybe what the longer term economic outlook is. And we'll begin with the last recording from Jeffrey Kingston.
Well, a lot of things are beyond the control of Japan. A lot has to do with the recovery of global markets. And so the Japanese economy is closely tied to China and the United States. So China's economy has rebounded relatively quickly, and that is good news for Japan. The United States economy also seems to be turning the corner, but who knows? So that's good news for Japan's recovery. I think the problem that they can actually address are domestic problems, which is the slump in domestic consumption. Because a lot of non-regular workers lost their jobs, bonuses have been cut, wages haven't increased. So Abenomics was on life support even before the pandemic. The pandemic has wiped out the entire growth recorded during the Abe administration. So GDP increased steadily over his tenure, and in 2020, all of those increases were wiped out. So they're starting sort of a blank slate. I think there has to be something focusing on rural innovation, rural development. Perhaps that would mean that the government, with Bank of Japan, purchasing municipal and local bonds to fund rural development initiatives. I think perhaps some sort of basic income policy on a temporary basis might be helpful. I think that they need to introduce more innovative policies than they have so far. And Suga, who's the new prime minister, has said he's going to more or less follow Abenomics' game plan. And if he does, I think that that is probably not encouraging news. I think that Suga has to go beyond Abe and Abenomics. And one of the things that he has stood for is a digital ministry or digital agency. And I think, the pandemic is a great opportunity for Japan to introduce increased teleworking. Now, this was already going on, but it has been accelerated by the pandemic as companies have encouraged workers to work from home, as you and I are today. And teleworking, I think, helps promote the government's policy of a work-life balance. I think for a lot of working parents, it's really difficult to raise kids. This sort of lowers the fertility and contributes to Japan's ongoing demographic time bomb. So I think there are real opportunities on the upside here. People rethinking their priorities, rethinking their lifestyle. A lot of people realize, well, what's the point of living in the city? I can telework from home. I can have a much bigger, nicer house, living in a cleaner environment outside the big cities. So I think, this is a chance for Japan to reinvent itself.
Okay. I know that Aimee Palumbo has to run off very shortly. So why don't we start with Aimee and your perspectives?
I'd actually like to hear from some of the other, I know I have to go soon, but I guess I'll just say that until we kind of solve the public health crisis, and especially in in areas where, you know, we know that women everywhere take on the majority of the caregiving roles. So the combination, of course, you know, the combination of their jobs being vulnerable and also maybe putting them at high risk for contracting this in the first place. And then also being vulnerable to, you know, losing their job in combination with being tasked, you know, consciously or not, with the majority of the caregiving roles. You know, I think we're going to see this have kind of long-term impact on their decisions and their attachment to the labor force. And, you know, like, I don't know, I guess just working, like he was saying, working from home kind of in combination with, you know, having to do childcare, it just kind of exacerbates that tension that women were already more prone to before this. So I will be looking to in your comments, you asked if, you know, the vaccine would be a magic bullet, and if anything, it'll be a very, very slow moving bullet because it's going to take a long time to deploy. And, you know, as we, you know, kind of protect those at most risk of exposure and those at most risk of severe outcomes, you know, we can start to get things open back up, but how long that will take, I don't know. But I think how long it takes will impact, you know, the extent of the impact on everybody, but also especially on women.
Okay, well, Aimee raised the idea of a magic bullet. Dr. Lim, is there a magic bullet on the horizon?
Well, I'll say that at least there seems to be some optimism. I think we all kind of had a sigh of relief when we saw that there are definitely strong movements in the area of vaccines. And so, you know, just as a quick recap, you know, there are 2 vaccines which both look tremendously effective. You know, and the data that we have right now really is limited to what the companies themselves are putting out, and the data will be reviewed by the FDA. But I understand actually on the way home, I just heard a news report that Pfizer reached their safety milestones. So they are putting in the FDA applications for emergency usage that will be reviewed in the next, you know, coming weeks. So I think that it's not the magic bullet. It will be the part of a multi-pronged ultimate management of the pandemic and bringing it down. Again, you know, like I said, the behavioral aspects are very challenging to sustain over a long period of time because it's against human nature to be separate. But I think, you know, if we look at this, we're going to be seeing, if all goes smoothly, you know, the first year, you know, within hopefully they're saying by the end of the calendar year or into the new year, and then more widespread distribution into the spring. There's obviously a huge amount of infrastructure challenges with the distribution. And then, you know, certainly it's not just nationally, it's internationally. But in the meantime, I think that people need to still be vigilant with regard to the mitigation strategies of the mask wearing, the hand washing, the social distancing, the gatherings. It's a very challenging time right now with the holidays. This is all part of our daily conversations with our patients now. But I will also, you know, for the little bit that I can add or emphasize on the economic front is I think that Tony Fauci really did say it correctly when he said the only way we can open the economy is by these public health measures of controlling the pandemic. And the fact that it was pitted against each other in our country was really just devastating because he, you know, the politics made it an either or instead of a coordinated effort of necessity.
Okay, Francesca, any thoughts?
Yes. About women, I can bring you my experience because I have a daughter which is 6 months ago. She was born 6 months ago, and during the pandemic, the first wave of the pandemic, it means that I worked from home because I worked until the last day of the pregnancy, and it made me work more and more because of the pandemic. Because without the pandemic, I would have been at home. But in other sense, I work it from home. So it is just my experience, but I'm not so on the field of research of women, but yes, on the field of research of socio-sanitary issues, especially in Italy. And what I can tell you is that the healthcare system were unprepared because in front of a large concentration of super specialties in hospitals in Italy, the third millennium healthcare is concentrated on the improvement of long life mainly. There is a low efficiency of territorial healthcare in the territorial site to the patient, the medicine of proximity, we call it. It means that even the differences between regions were motivated by this. Because even if we have a very big public health system in Italy, we don't have a lot of proximity. And the other reason why we had a very big deal during the pandemic, the first wave, but even now we have other explosions of the pandemic, is that especially in the first wave, Italy is one of the older countries of the world. It means that we have a large part of people that were the fragile part of the in front of the virus. And in addition, there is a cultural attitude, which is a very big deal. It means the patients an habitude to go to the doctor when they feel some symptoms, but only when there is an advancement of this disease. Let's say the cultural attitude in Italy, especially, I don't speak for other countries, is that we trust in medicines at the point that we are not so worried about some symptom. So especially the older people, so the people that maybe should be more monitored, without a medicine of proximity plus this cultural attitude, didn't care themselves in the first wave, and the virus spread out very quickly.
Okay, Fab, the last word is yours.
All right. Yeah, well, I just wanted to, I mean, I think everyone has made a very valid point. I just wanted to add a kind of one layer to the discussion, which kind of complicates, I think, all of those issues of the vaccine distribution and even the political and economic, long-term outlook. And from a communication point of view, I think one of the things that we're seeing that's, for communication scholars and media studies scholars that is concerning to us, is this shift towards a post-truth society with digital media and Facebook and Twitter and the echo chamber that makes it very difficult to control the information that's being exchanged and the quality of information that's being exchanged. And I think that's going to be a challenge in terms of moving forwards in terms of the vaccine distribution. Already we're dealing with all sorts of conspiracy theories about the virus itself, but also the vaccines and their effectiveness, and even from an economic point of view. I mean, we're making typically our theories have assumed that individuals are rational and that they're making rational decisions based on information. And I think one of the challenges that we're in today and that we're finding in our current situation is that there's just so much information out there that is not necessarily factual, and and people can live in those echo chambers where they essentially are finding themselves in an alternative reality. And we see that with politics in the US, the election being one example of it, still a portion of the population feeling that Donald Trump won the election. So I think that from a media point of view, those are some of the things that we'll have to take into consideration, and that might enter or affect kind of the long-term economic, political, and health outcomes of the pandemic, is how much we can control that information and how much and it might include platforms like Facebook and Twitter, who have started to kind of intervene in shifting through the facts, right, and deleting or pointing out, flagging information that is blatantly, false, But I think that's another big challenge that we're facing.
Okay, well, thank you. And I think we'll now turn to the Q&A, and I'll turn the reins over to Evan Bossio, who will be handling at least moderating the question and answer portion.
Thanks. Yeah. Okay. We have some great questions here. So I'll start with one from Hamida. How soon will society go back to quote unquote normal after vaccine distribution, or will it take a while longer for those changes to happen? So whoever wants to take that.
Well, I'll take it from at least a medical perspective, in the sense that it's not going to be a light switch overnight. It's really truly going to take, unfortunately, I think more time than it should. There has been a lot of erosion of trust, at least here in the United States, with regard to vaccines. So even though we have what looks like to be a very effective vaccine, I think we are going to have challenges with regard to vaccine hesitancy and the acceptance of the vaccine in our population. There's going to have to be a lot of community engagement, especially with marginalized communities that we have not done a great job in engaging in the past, with medical apartheid and all the experiments. And so it's going to take time. So I think that I'm very curious from the panelists who have much more of a background in sociology than I do. But I think the longer this lingers, right, the more sustaining the changes will be. And I do think that from many aspects, I don't know that it will be a normal, it will be a change. There will be shifts across many spheres that I don't think that it will go back to what it was.
I think that's very important, what Dr. Lim just said, which is that what we think of as normal in the future is not going to be what we thought of as normal last February. And it's going to be, we will settle down into some sense of normal, but it's not going to be the same normal.
Yeah, in France, people talk about the new normal that's going to come after the pandemic. And I think that, that's pretty accurate. I think that there will be definitely long-term changes.
In the general theory of collective trauma, we say that any kind of this event go away without leaving something. It means that we will not be never the same. This is for sure. It doesn't mean that it will be a sadder world or not the same world as before. Maybe it can be a better world, more aware, more positive, because we experienced the importance of some things like the contact, for example, or the necessity to grab the food we need or to stay with families and blah, blah, blah. So normally is a world that it scares me because it means that we were normal before. I don't think so. Normally the big events create a tattoo on the soul of the people and in some way fix a generation, like the wars, for example, like the big crisis. And I'm positive. I think that and I study collective trauma, so I'm positive it is a good news. It means that maybe starting from a situation like this, we can find a new way to build the future. So it means that we should be proud of what we will be after the situation. I think this is the base to build up something more than before.
Great. I'll move on to the next question. Carly says that from a student perspective, online learning is much different. So what is the biggest challenge from a teaching perspective, teaching online?
I can jump in. When I heard that I had to teach online, I was devastated because I'm totally not an online type of person. And I was, I thought that would be just, that was going to be really painful. And I think, if there's a silver lining to this, is that I think that we're learning to do this a lot better. Certainly, I think most of us are a lot better at it than we were in the spring when we had, like literally 2 days to get ready to do this. And there's things that, of course, the direct contact, I think to me, the most difficult part actually is all the things that happen outside of the classroom. So not necessarily, while we're all together, but with the students not being connected to each other. There's no word of mouth communication. There's no, none of that, a sense of group membership that happens on the margins of my class time. And I direct a PhD program, and I have the same struggle with a new cohort of students and getting them to bond with each other. I've actually started coming to my class a little bit early to kind of organically create some moments like that, and then sometimes I'll leave the meeting early to let my students be just with each other without me in the class. But there's also, some really cool things that you can do, I think, with online teaching. And one of the things that, this kind of thing, right, where we have people in different parts of the world coming in and intervening and bringing in their perspectives. And I think that if you're kind of willing to put in a little bit of that work as a teacher, I think that that can be really beneficial. So I've brought a whole bunch of people into my classroom that otherwise I probably wouldn't have been able to bring, because Temple doesn't let me fly people into my class on a regular basis. But when it's on Zoom, and all I'm asking for them is like maybe a 20-minute intervention, right? Even if it's late for them or whatever, it's their Friday evening, they may be more willing to come. So I think there's also, and I hope that will change the way that we all teach, and that we'll all be using the technology more in our teaching and taking kind of the best elements of that and integrating them into our teaching to a greater extent that perhaps most of us did in the past.
As an instructor, one thing I've found very difficult is reading a room. That when I'm live, I can tell by students' expressions, by their body language, whether they're getting it, whether they're bored, whether they're upset over something I said. When there are these little thumbnail images, it's much harder. So I find, as an instructor, I find that hard. What I really feel bad about is the freshman class, the first year students. They've lost a senior year of high school. They don't have part of college, part of the college experience, only part of it is being in the classroom. Another big segment of it is learning how to relate to different people, learning how to live in proximity to people who are not like you, who aren't from where you're from, who aren't from your particular group. Joining something bigger than yourself, being in the Asian students group, being in the marching band, being in whatever, Young Republicans, anything, whatever it is, being a part of something, and they're just being deprived of that. And I really ache for them. I feel very, very bad for our students.
I absolutely agree with that. I think that one of the things moving to teaching online has done is that it has made us really very deliberate about what we are trying to do, what is the educational objective, and not think, well, how do I shift this? Like if I would do it this way in person and now I need to do it by video, and it's not going to work this way. But if we stay true to what is the objective that we are trying to do, and then this is the platform in which we're doing it, and then being really creative about it, I think that that's been a reframing that has been helpful for me. And if you think about it, in the medical school, I mean, we're teaching people, we're teaching, I mean, we've been able to do in person, but now we have shifted. And this week we're doing a patient encounter, and it's a neuro exam, and the standardized patient is a screen, you know, on Zoom. And we've had to be really creative. It's like, well, how do you assess strength? And so they're going to put a rubber band around their hand and be able to, like, how far can they stretch their hand, you know, or act that it's a weakness compared one side versus the other. And that type of innovation and just thinking outside the box and creativity is really exciting. And that's really fun. And it is very energizing. I will say things like the chat has brought out a different dynamic and a different dimension to other students that I would not have heard from otherwise. So I think that kind of thinking about it in that way has been very helpful, and not just seeing the things of how it used to be done, how we can't do it this way, but it's about how do we do it differently.
Yes, I just add that this is a very crucial point for sociology. We are very worried about this situation in terms of the future generation, which now are in an educational path which is isolated, let's say. In sociology, we say that the society is built during the coffee break. It means that the classes are useful to learn, but to build the social identity, which is a very important piece of the identity of everyone, we need all the surrounding, all the scenario that is around the class. It means the body language, the communication, what happens out of the classes, physically speaking. And to do a society for the new generations means even to have a formation and education experiences live in person. Not to have this experience means to lose pieces of an identity. Us as a professor is the same, but we are very worried because our mission is even to form students, not only transmitting culture, but even having relationship with them.
That brings us to time. So we don't have any more time for those questions.
Well, if I could, then I would just like to thank each and every one of our panelists. I think they've done a wonderful job of providing us all with some very, very important things to think about. And I certainly learned a lot in the last hour or so. And I just cannot thank you enough for giving of your time to help us here. And I want to remind all of you again, you too can take advantage in your classes, instructors, if you want to get an instructor like Professor Lenzi or Professor Kingston to come to your class and provide an international perspective to what you're doing. I encourage you to do so. Oh, those of you who are in Fox, please note there's a little QR image here that you can take a picture of for your leadership development points. Again, thank you one and all. Thank you to Suzanne for setting this up. It was a wonderful experience for me, and I hope it was for all of you.
Great.
Pleasure. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.